Glass shattered. Shouts rang out from behind the door. Camera flashes popped like fireworks. The U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, Scott Bessent, burst out of the closed-door meeting in a state no one could have imagined. Tie askew, face flushed, papers clutched in his hands like he'd just come through a heated argument. He didn't answer any questions from the press. He only said 5 words. "We've already sent the letters." Then he disappeared down the long hallway leading back toward the White House offices. No further questions were allowed. No one knew what had just happened inside that room filled with pounding fists, anger, and clashing opinions. But the public didn't have to wait long to find out. Less than 2 hours later, the letters Bessent had mentioned were released. Over 100 countries received the exact same message at the exact same time. Either renegotiate trade agreements on America's terms, or prepare to face new tariffs, possibly as high as 50%. No exceptions, no sugarcoating, no negotiations. It read like a final warning before a war no one could predict the length of or how many economies it might damage along the way. This time, the Trump administration wasn't targeting China. They were targeting the entire world. From its content to its delivery, the Treasury's negotiation letter looked more like an ultimatum than an invitation. They weren't asking for talks, they were laying down terms. No roadmaps were proposed, just deadlines. The entire US media erupted at once, describing the move as a mass trade bombing order, a gangster-style trade policy, or Trump Doctrine 2.0, no longer America first, but America only. And then, the most unbelievable thing happened. Most of the countries that received the letter didn't respond. No protests, no press conferences, no official statements, just a quiet stillness. A silence that felt chilling. But to those with political experience, it wasn't confusion. It was a stance, a message, a kind of reply that didn't need to be written. We don't need you anymore. And to understand why, we have to look beyond the doors of Washington, because on the other side of the horizon, a new gravitational force is taking shape, called BRICS. And this time, it's not just an economic bloc. It's becoming the alternative to an old order that just lost its greatest power: persuasion. Silence, not out of fear, but because there was no need to respond. The quiet dismissal by over 60 countries of America's ultimatum wasn't a coincidence. It was the result of more than 2 decades of quiet yet steady transformation, where economic influence has gradually shifted away from Washington and toward new centers: Beijing, New Delhi, Moscow, even Riyadh and Brasilia. According to Bloomberg data, among the 100 nations that received the letter, more than 63 now have higher trade volumes with China or India than with the US. And these aren't just small or vulnerable countries. They include emerging economies like Mexico, Turkey, the UAE, South Africa, and Indonesia. These nations no longer orbit around the old center of gravity. This shift wasn't driven by politics, but by the hard truth of the market. While the G7, the Western economic powers, have seen their share of global GDP fall from 70% to just 43% since 2000, BRICS, once only a loose alliance, has surged from 18% to 34% and is projected to exceed 46% if new applicants like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Indonesia formally join next year. This isn't some distant future. It's already happening. And countries are starting to ask themselves, why force negotiations with an increasingly unpredictable America when they can partner with those offering opportunity, credit, markets, and more balanced relationships? The world no longer has to choose between the US or chaos. Because now there's a third option, a new order, where nations don't have to bow, but can stand tall as equals. And that's precisely what's making Washington lose its grip. When tariffs no longer make the world tremble, the first casualty isn't the market, it's the ego of power. Trump understood that. And he reacted in the way he always does. Not with dialogue, but with retaliation. Just 1 week after the wave of global silence, the White House issued a new directive. Any country showing signs of benefiting from BRICS trade policies would face special tariffs, starting at 10%, with the possibility of increases depending on the level of anti-American behavior. But what counts as anti-American behavior? No one could say. And that was the moment a shadow of uncertainty fell across the entire global trade order. Trump was never the kind of man to accept defeat in silence. When more than half the world brushed off the Treasury's negotiation letter, he didn't see it as the end. He saw it as a declaration of war. And so, a new law was born, signed just 72 hours after a heated cabinet meeting. People called it the anti-BRICS tariff. But in reality, it resembled a massive net cast across the globe. Any country daring to show friendliness toward BRICS could become a target for sanctions. The problem was, what exactly counts as friendliness toward BRICS? There was no clear definition. If a country traded oil with China in yuan, did that mean it was anti-American? If Brazil paid for military equipment from Russia using the real, would that be a violation? And if an African nation took a loan from a BRICS bank instead of the IMF, would it be taxed? This ambiguity sent ripples of fear through every layer of the global economy. Even longtime US allies felt the threat looming. Germany, the economic backbone of the EU, could easily find itself in the crosshairs if one of its tech firms received funding from a Hong Kong investment fund. Japan, South Korea, and Australia all have trade ties with India and China. Were they safe? Everything suddenly felt fragile. And the markets, always hypersensitive to uncertainty, reacted instantly. Just one day after Scott Bessent's speech unveiling the new tax policy, the S&P 500 plummeted 2.1%. No one knew who might be next on the sanctions list. There was no roadmap, no appeals process. Only one thing remained: confusion. But while the US chose to punish in order to maintain control, BRICS, on the other side, was quietly expanding its influence with a completely different strategy. No grandstanding, no bold declarations, just steady, deliberate steps toward building a parallel ecosystem, one with no room for coercion, only cooperation, trust, and long-term benefit. A new world is quietly taking shape, and with every step it takes, the foundations of the old order tremble just a little more. When Washington struck with tariffs, BRICS didn't respond with bold declarations or matching threats. They chose a different path: silence and construction. No fanfare, no media spotlights, just numbers and capital, precise, quiet, but immensely powerful. In 2024, despite a global recession, total trade between China and BRICS nations surpassed 4.6 trillion yuan, roughly $650 billion USD. That figure wasn't just an economic achievement. It was a statement that the world no longer relies on a single center of power. When Argentina and Brazil shifted over 40% of their trade outside the US dollar, it was a symbolic move. But when the Gulf Cooperation Council agreed to accept oil payments in yuan, that was a milestone. At first, financial analysts wrote it off as political theater. But when more than 37 countries opened yuan-based payment channels and central banks began accumulating gold reserves instead of dollars, it was no longer about shifting direction. It was about replacing the system. The People's Bank of China quietly purchased over 34 tons of gold in just 8 months. No one explained why. But everyone understood gold isn't controlled by the US banking system. It isn't tied to Fed interest rates. It can't be manipulated by debt ceilings or budget crises in Washington. And the money flows didn't stop there. A traditionally cautious Christian pension fund in Germany invested $50 million into a Chinese tech fund based in Hong Kong. The signal couldn't be clearer. Investors no longer trust Wall Street's stability the way they used to. Confidence is shifting, and capital always follows confidence. Meanwhile, nations across Africa, South America, and Central Asia signed new memorandums of understanding with BRICS, covering clean energy, digital infrastructure, and logistics. They didn't need to voice opposition to the US, they simply needed to build their own roads. The world is slowly splitting into two currents, one of coercion, the other of connection. One uses tariffs to keep friends, the other uses cooperation to make them. And when the current of connection grows strong enough, every barrier, no matter how sharp, becomes useless. Because a blade, when turned the wrong way, cuts back at the one who wields it. And that is exactly what's happening in Washington, where faith in tariffs is beginning to backfire, not on China or India, but on American businesses and the American people themselves. Washington has long believed it holds the world's most powerful leverage, a consumer market worth over $3.1 trillion annually. The thinking goes, if access to the US market is threatened, any country will be forced to back down. But leverage, when misused, stops being an advantage and becomes a double-edged sword. This time, that blade is cutting back into the hand that wields it. Trump signed an executive order imposing additional tariffs on hundreds of imported goods, from lithium batteries and microchips to pharmaceuticals, auto parts, and industrial raw materials. The target was China, but the impact landed squarely on the shoulders of American businesses. In today's globalized supply chain, a chip made in Thailand might contain components from China, be packaged in Vietnam, and shipped via Mexico, meaning a tariff on one link disrupts the entire chain. Production costs soared. Retail prices in the US began to climb day by day. A shipment of smartphones priced at $899 in June shot up to $1,029 in just 2 months. American consumers didn't need to read economic reports, they just had to look at their grocery bills to understand what was happening. Factories began slashing orders. Investment in manufacturing infrastructure stalled. The stock market wavered. According to the Peterson Institute for Economics, if the new tariffs are fully implemented in Q3, inflation in the US could rise by another 5 to 7 percentage points, pushing the country back to the instability of the 1970s, when everything was expensive but wages couldn't keep up. Worse still, the new tariff policy was paired with tax cuts for high-income earners, a contradiction that only deepened inequality. A report from the Tax Policy Center showed that the wealthiest 20% of Americans would see an average benefit of 2.3%, while the poorest 20% would lose roughly 2.3% of their real income. The rift between social classes is no longer a looming threat. It's present, visible, and spreading fast. But the greatest paradox isn't the tax system itself, it's the brutal truth. America is now being squeezed by the very system it once designed. The institutions Washington built to control the world are now powering a new global order, one that no longer needs the US at the top. Perhaps the most bitter pill for America isn't being turned away by the world, but being betrayed by its own creations. The very institutions Washington painstakingly built after World War II, from the IMF, World Bank, and WTO to the SWIFT payment system, were once the backbone of a global order led by the United States. They bore the imprint of a time when America was not only a military and economic superpower, but also the patron of rules, ethics, and international commitments. But over time, those institutions were misused, politicized, and, more critically, transformed into tools of pressure rather than platforms for cooperation. Economic sanctions, asset freezes, exclusion from SWIFT, these were once powerful weapons in the West's arsenal. But the more they were used, the more the world learned how to sidestep them or replicate them to gain independence. And so a cycle began. The very systems America created were gradually cloned, altered, and eventually excluded from the transactions they once dominated. SWIFT now has competitors. China developed CIPES. Russia uses SPFS. Many nations across Africa, the Middle East, and Asia have begun transacting in local currencies or even gold. The IMF now watches as countries negotiate regional financial frameworks without Washington's backing. And the WTO, once a symbol of free trade, has become a forum bogged down in endless disputes where America's voice is increasingly met with skepticism. In a world where technology allows anyone to write new rules of the game, America now finds itself adrift when the old rules no longer apply. Trump and Scott Bessent didn't build a new counterweight. They simply tried to plug leaks with tariffs, while the entire ship was already changing course. Meanwhile, the world doesn't need to defeat the US. It only needs to keep building a parallel system, similar in structure, but without Washington at the center. A system where resources, populations, technology, investment capital no longer pass through Wall Street, but flow directly to where trust is greater. And once gravity shifts, no superpower can force the planets to orbit in reverse. In silence, the old order is receding. And if America doesn't change at its core, its isolation won't come from enemies, but from the very values that once made it great. We are living in a pivotal moment in history, a moment without gunfire, without trenches, yet one that sends tremors through the entire global system. What was once thought unshakable, from the dominance of the US dollar to the weight of American tariffs, is now being tested by those who once followed its lead. The world is no longer waiting for the US to take the helm. Nations are charting their own paths, redrawing maps of influence, and choosing their own way forward. Tariffs, once a weapon that made countries tread carefully, have become a fading echo from a bygone era. The question is no longer who is stronger, but who better understands the moment. Trump may spin the world into a new spiral. BRICS may go farther than anyone imagined. But at its core, the United States must now confront a question it has long avoided. Who are they in a world they no longer control? If you have something to say, leave a comment below. And if this video helped you see the world a little more clearly, share it. You never know. Someone else might be out there searching for the same answers.